You can sit over there. No. O aquí.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the hybrid seminar of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, the director of the center. And before I introduce our speaker today, Luis Rodriguez, who is going to talk about Latin American reactions to the Ukrainian crisis, an extremely timely topic, I do want to note that because this is also being broadcast through YouTube, through our webinar live stream, you can use, the lecture itself will be available for the general public in our class YouTube page. And you can also use the function there for sending questions and comments through the YouTube chat. And I will make sure that I can convey them to our speaker during the Q&A session. For those of us who are at Stanford, I do want to acknowledge that we are in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer gratitude for the land, for the water, for the air that surrounds us, and pay our respects to the past, the present, and the future of the Ohlone and the Lenape peoples, who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. As a side note, I might mention, I was 2 days ago, I was in the Native American Museum in New York, which is an incredible exhibit where you can see the presence of the indigenous peoples from Patagonia all the way to the Inuit in one exhibit as you walk through, and you can see how these cultures are so alive and so vibrant through their antiquities, through their pre-Hispanic, pre-colonial presence, but also in their manifestations today. It's just daunting to think of how they are still present with us everywhere in the continent. So wherever you are, try to learn a little bit more about the original peoples who inhabit your territories. Luis Rodriguez, he is the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow in the Center for International Security and Cooperation, CSAC, at Stanford University. I do want to pause for a second here because I believe, I could be wrong, I tried to research it, but this is probably the first Stanton Fellow that I could figure out who comes from Latin America, because this is a very prestigious fellowship, mostly on nuclear security issues. There are Stanton Fellows in the Council of Foreign Relations, in RAND Corporation at Harvard, here at Stanford. I believe you are probably the first Latin American Stanton that I can think of and that I could do research on. His research has been thinking about the global South as it builds limits on the use of force in international law and organization. He focuses primarily on negotiations to codify humanitarian intervention norms, and then he also looks at nuclear arms and non-proliferation mechanisms, the Tlatelolco Treaty, among other things he has worked on, and some other agenda he has on rules of cyberspace. He has a PhD in political science from the Department of Political Science of Johns Hopkins University. He's I assume international relations from Colegio de Mexico, one of the premier institutions of social science in Mexico. And before coming here, he has been a junior advisor to the Mexican Vice Minister for Latin American Affairs in the Mexican Foreign Affairs Ministry. And he's also been a fellow in the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. So thank you so much, Luis, for being here with us. And we're looking forward to your talk.
No, thank you, Arturo. I want to start by thanking the Bolivar House for having me. This is the first time also that I'm coming to the Bolivar House. It's weird to be in such a huge campus because we end up being in so many different opposite directions in this city, and it's the first time that I'm here, so thank you for the invite. Let me start my presentation with a disclaimer. I put up this presentation in attempts to understand ongoing events, and the situation is changing constantly. So instead of presenting a finished product, I decided to have a more interactive conversation with you. When I was also in the PhD program, I really enjoyed teaching, and I haven't had the opportunity to teach in class, so I kind of treat this as basically my opportunity to pretend that I'm teaching again. So feel free to ask questions whenever you have one. I'm gonna break up my presentation and give you moments, especially to have a Q&A. And then at the end, if you want to save your questions until the end, I'm gonna save a little bit of time also to have a final Q&A. But in general, feel free to interrupt whenever you have a question. And I'm bringing to bear my research on, as Arturo was explaining, Latin American, as Alberto was explaining, sorry, the Latin American defense of limits on the use of force through multilateralism and international law. And this is just me plugging a special issue that is coming up soon, but I'm also co-editing a forthcoming special issue, the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, on this issue, on trying to understand how Latin America approaches the international order with amazing scholars, including Christy Thornton from Johns Hopkins University, Tom Long, who is at Warwick now, but was previously at CIDE in Mexico, Carson Andres Schulz, who is now at Cambridge, but was at La Cato in Chile, Juan Pablo Scarfi, who is at La Universidad de San Andrés, and Cassandra Emmons, who is in the International Foundation of Electoral Systems, but was also previously at Harvard. So what I'm doing is basically giving you a commercial of this special issue, taking some of these ideas that these authors are putting together to try to understand how Latin America is currently reacting to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Let me give you my main argument up front. My main argument is that while current considerations inform the Latin American positions in this conflict, the Latin American region has responded by following regional, traditional, and historical approaches to the international order in a consistent way. So, while I pay attention to the economic, military, and political considerations happening now, I also think that these reactions are embedded in historical traditions of approaching the international order. Okay. I have divided the presentation in 4 sections. I will start presenting a brief overview of how Western analysts and Global South states have reacted to the crisis. Then I will talk about why most Latin American governments have criticized Russia, why there is a minority reticent to do so, and I will end up by explaining the risks that the crisis presents for the UN as a system and to the global nuclear order. So let me start. Because we only have an hour and a half, I'm not going to go into the details of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, especially because I also think that analysts in Western countries, also especially in the US, have been trying to understand what is happening and the consequences of what is happening to the international order. And by international order, I mean the different institutions and organizations trying to uphold what some analysts call a rule-based order. And there are different positions with contrasting diagnoses about what is happening and the effects of the Russian invasion. On the one hand, you have some observers that are optimistic about the consequences. And they think that there are signs of a renewed US leadership in the international order, that there is somehow a Western solidarity with Ukraine, and that there is an emerging consensus that this is a Russian invasion and that we should keep Russia accountable. An example of someone with this point of view is Stuart Patrick in the Council of Foreign Relations, who is being advocating to strengthen the international order and the rule-based international order. On the other hand, you have a more pessimistic point of view of what is happening. And you have observers that pay attention to the challenges that the Russian invasion presents for the international rules. And these authors have some doubts also about how capable is the US to exert some type of leadership, especially when you see different actors, different states in the Global South, for example, not following the US leadership. Authors in this camp include Amitabh Acharya in the American University, who have been writing for a long time about a post-Western world, a post-American world. The reactions in the Global South are also equally divided. You have some countries, for example Kenya, that have used the different sessions in the UN to reject any kind of intervention, including the current Russian invasion in Ukraine, but also reminding the different delegates in these debates that this is not something that Russia is doing alone, or that Russia is unique in doing this. The ambassador of Kenya, for example, in the UN Security Council, when he was explaining the voting that he was, or the vote that he was proposing, reminded people about the coalition of the willing intervention in Iraq in 2003 by basically saying that this is great powers in general that are trying to violate these rules and the rule-based order. You have other countries, among them Indonesia, that have joined the US and Europe in condemning the Russian actions, but still they refuse to impose economic sanctions, arguing that they will not blindly follow the West. You also have some governments, like Pakistan, that have also expressed discomfort when Western countries ask them to join in condemning the Russian invasion. Pakistan, for example, has also said that Pakistan is not a slave of the West and is not going to blindly follow whatever the West is trying to do in terms of reacting to Russia. And then finally, you have several countries, especially in the African continent, that have pointed out that Europe and the US have treated Ukrainian refugees better than people fleeing conflict zones in other regions. So they are pointing out what they call Western hypocrisy in the reactions to what is happening in Ukraine. This division in the Global South is also reflected in Latin America. Latin America has reacted in contrasting ways to the Russian invasion. And while there are domestic divisions in some countries between career diplomats and presidents, most governments in the region have voted in favor of criticizing Russia in different UN resolutions. For instance, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution yesterday calling to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. And here we can see the division in how Latin America is thinking about what is happening. While most countries in the region voted in favor of suspending Russia from the Council, Bolivia, Cuba, and Nicaragua voted against the resolution. Venezuela currently doesn't have a right of vote in the UN because of the different debt that they have to the organization, but they would have potentially voted against it. And then you have countries like Belize, Brazil, Salvador, Guyana, Mexico, and Suriname who also abstain. So I'm going to start by trying to understand why have some Latin American countries been reticent to criticize Russia. And as I said, most Latin American countries have condemned the Russian actions as an invasion. But there is a minority of states in the region who are reticent to criticize Russia. And there are three potential explanations for this reticence. The first explanation that some analysts and scholars have pointed out focuses on the military implications of supporting Russia. Some pundits argue that Latin America could become, yet again, a platform that Russia can use to increase its military capabilities to challenge the US. They quote, the analysts that believe this, they quote Russian Deputy Foreign Minister's statement in mid-January saying that Russia could possibly put military infrastructure in countries like Venezuela and Cuba to respond to US aggressions. And while I think that it's important to pay attention to these geopolitical considerations, I also side with the State Department and several Latin American specialists when they dismiss this possibility. We haven't seen a build-up of military infrastructure since January. I think it might be too early to diagnose if this is actually a figure that we should pay attention to. But for now, there is not a build-up of military infrastructure. Some analysts even warn about Latin American authoritarian governments seeing the Russian actions in Ukraine as a precedent that they could follow. For example, in the Venezuelan case, some people have argued, especially in foreign policy, the magazine, that the Maduro administration could use this as a precedent to then use Venezuelan military forces to solve the territorial dispute between Venezuela and Guyana over the oil-rich Essequibo region. And just as a little bit of history, this is a region that Guyana and Venezuela have been disputing over years, and Venezuela has been increasingly intimidating Guyana. And some analysts argue that the Russian invasion in Ukraine is weakening the territorial integrity principle, and that because of that, Venezuela could use this as a precedent to then say that, well, if this rule is not strong enough, if I don't have to respect it, maybe I'm going to solve this territorial dispute using force. I'm skeptical about this argument just because I think that Venezuela could not get away with the same actions that Russia is implementing in Ukraine four different geopolitical conditions. One of them is that Venezuela doesn't have a nuclear weapon, Russia does, and that could deter some actions that other Western countries could use against Russia that they would use against Venezuela. So that's the first explanation, the military geopolitical factors. The second explanation that some authors pay attention to explain this reticence focuses on maybe the fact that these countries don't want to jeopardize their strategic relations with Russia. And here they pay attention to how Western actors have criticized the domestic practices of these regimes, especially the authoritarian practices that some of these governments have implemented. So in response, these countries have tried to diversify their political relations. They have tried to pay attention to strategic partnerships with other countries in order to have diplomatic allies. And while Putin's government cannot offer an economic lifeline, for example, it can offer a diplomatic lifeline for these countries. A corollary of this explanation focuses on what some authors call authoritarian affinities. And there is this idea that authoritarian governments, they don't respect international law as much. So if you are an authoritarian government and you see another authoritarian government not respecting the international order's rules, then you will not criticize them because there is an authoritarian affinity there. There is a third and final explanation that, for me, is a little bit more convincing. And there is this idea that these countries have an anti-Western position more than a pro-Russian position. So they are reticent to criticize Russia, not because they condone what is happening or they support the Russian actions in Ukraine, but because they see this as a moment where they could criticize the West. So let me give you a little bit of background here. And this is the first time that I'm going to plug in that special issue that I was talking about at the beginning. Juan Pablo Scarfi argues that there is what he calls a pluralist Latin American approach to the international order. And there is this idea that countries in the region deeply value international law and multilateralism. And they use these different tools, multilateralism and international law, to criticize US imperialism. So the idea is that these countries will use these different tools to try to avoid US interventionism and then to criticize Western hypocrisy in how the West uses rules and organizations. So countries relying on this diplomatic tradition argue that there are inequalities in the rules and systems and organizations in the international order that favor the West, and that the West can also get away with violating international law. So they disapprove of past Western abuses of international law. We can see that in the different justifications of the votings in the US from these countries by saying that, well, the US did this in 2003 with the coalition of the willing. The US doesn't approve with that criticism, but these countries are constantly pointing out to the precedent of 2003. And here, what these countries are saying, especially Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, is that Russia's actions for them are legitimate because this is a legitimate defense against the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which they claim threatens Russian security interests. But even despite this position, these countries keep asking for a peaceful solution of the conflict. They keep asking to try to find a solution through multilateral organizations and following international law. So in a way, I don't know if the authoritarian affinities argument that I was explaining before holds, because these countries, even if it is just cheap talk, they keep asking for a peaceful solution through the rules and the organizations of the order. It's just that they are using this moment to criticize the West yet again. So these countries are relying on these different traditions that they have to justify what they are doing. El Salvador stands out. El Salvador is a country that is not following this tradition, but is also reticent to criticize Russia. But they are following a different diplomatic tradition, non-alignment. What they are saying is that this is somehow a Cold War hangover moment, and they are not going to take positions. They are not either going to support Russia or going to support the Western criticism of Russia, so they prefer to stay out. And the whole point was, or is, that this is a conflict that is far away from them. They have no stakes in this. They have no strong relations with Russia, so they prefer to stay out of this. So, to wrap up and open the Q&A for the first time, countries that are reticent to support criticisms of Russia do this because they are either following a pluralist diplomatic tradition of engaging with the international order, or because they are using a non-alignment position of engaging with the international order. Questions?
I do have a question, because for the benefit of this audience, you went so quickly on the Mearsheimer argument. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's very good context.
Yeah.
And what you think. I mean, I'm asking a little bit your opinion as well. This is for the US debates.
About the whole Mearsheimer thing.
Well, not the whole, but
so John Mearsheimer is this, I don't want to talk down to you, but I give you a little context in case that you know about this, bear with me. John Mearsheimer is this realist US IR theorist who pays attention to great powers and the interactions between great powers, and he claims that NATO expansion interferes in the Russian sphere of influence, and thus whenever among great powers, whenever one great power group expands, the other group will naturally react, and will react potentially aggressively. He also has said that, following realism, a country where you have nuclear weapons will produce stability among great powers. He also acknowledges that stability among great powers doesn't mean that there is not going to be instability between great powers and minor powers. So he sees this as a natural consequence. And he reminds people that in the 90s he also wrote that Ukraine shouldn't have given up its nuclear weapons. And that if Ukraine hadn't, this wouldn't be happening. Because then Russia would be deterred to attack Ukraine. So Mearsheimer, the whole controversy is a little bit complicated, because right now Mearsheimer is saying that this is a natural consequence. But the Mearsheimer in the 90s also would have said, but maybe this would have been prevented if Ukraine would have kept nuclear weapons.
And your view? Sorry.
Let's wait until the final Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Bolsonaro said recently that he wouldn't take a stand, kind of like in an issue so far away from Brazil, and sort of like reinforcing this exemption position with the conflict. And I was wondering, like, what do you think that could be the consequences of not taking a stand, considering that the conflict seems to be escalating and it's going to last for a longer period of time? Like, what does it mean for Brazil as a country in relation to other Western powers? Yeah.
This is one of the main consequences of me breaking the presentation in Q&As. I'm going to address Brazil.
Okay.
But I do think that there is something to be said about non-alignment as a strategy in this specific moment. Mm-hmm. I think that, theoretically speaking, non-alignment makes sense for a country like El Salvador. If you pay attention to the justifications. With this, I'm not saying that El Salvador should stay out of the conflict, but the justification is, why should a small country engage in this like high politics, great power competition when I'm doing well here? Is this whole idea of, I don't want to bring the conflict to the region if the conflict is not bringing me there. Mm-hmm. We'll see. There is a difference between the interconnections in the international system now in comparison with the international system during the Cold War. Like, the levels of interconnections have increased so much that some authors, especially in The Guardian, have been, well, it's The Guardian, but some authors in The Guardian have been questioning whether non-alignment should still be a strategy. I don't have the tools to analyze that, but there is this idea of, well, if the system has changed so much, can a country still stay non-aligned and take no positions in this kind of conflicts? We will see.
The There is a question from the chat.
Yeah.
I think it's more of maybe a critical question, but they're asking you really what you mean by the international order.
Oh.
And maybe they want you to address a little bit the norms and the order, no?
Yeah. And that is also a very complicated question. It was a question of my dissertation. And it's complicated because there are different definitions of what is international order. The minimal definition, which is a definition that an author called Hadley Bull put forward in the 70s, is that there are minimal agreed upon rules among states. And he pays attention to primary rules or primary institutions such as international law, the principle of sovereignty, the multilateral organizations, and then the liberal international order, which is another concept, is a concept that John Eikenberry put forward in the early 2000s by saying that the United States, after World War II, took that infrastructure of rules, norms, and organizations and added liberal values to that, like the promotion of free trade, democracy, human rights, also principles of universal equality in multilateral organizations. But authors and analysts use different definitions, and that is why it's so difficult to engage in this debate, because authors will use different definitions. Even mainstream authors, though, acknowledge that these rules are hierarchical, and that the order, if we pay attention to the different multilateral organizations, also institutionalize inequalities. Pay attention to the Security Council with the veto power in comparison with all the other institutions in the UN. Pay attention to different percentages of voting in different economic organizations depending on how rich is your country. So those inequalities are enshrined. If we step away from the minimal definition is when we get into the whole problem of what is international order, what are the specific institutions, what are the specific values, who is the order benefiting, order for whom, so we get into all of these different debates. And the authors in this special issue are just using a very minimal definition, the specific minimal rules and organizations that are agreed upon among states, without paying so much attention to the values and actually criticizing or critically studying those different values. Christy Thornton, for example, second plug, in her paper for this special issue, pays attention to the inclusion of development as a topic that should be addressed in the economic agenda of the international order. And she pays attention to how Latin American countries, especially Mexico, were pushing for the inclusion of development in the agenda. But yeah, difficult question. I think that I saw a hand over there.
Yeah, so one thing that has been mentioned by some analysts is the role of vaccine diplomacy in several Latin American countries' stance. Do you have a position on the role of the Sputnik vaccine?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think that authors that pay attention to the strategic implications of not criticizing Russia would also pay attention to vaccine diplomacy. And it's this idea that, well, if I want to keep these vaccines coming to my country, and if I want to actually tackle the pandemic, Russia was the kind of ally that they had in this moment with Sputnik. So they don't, or these authors would say that maybe these countries don't want to jeopardize that relationship. If I'm honest with you, I haven't paid attention to the latest numbers in terms of vaccines coming into Latin America from Russia. So it would also be a matter of actually paying attention to what is the state of that strategic relationship in relation to tackling the pandemic. But yeah, I think that it would be included in the strategic, or not jeopardizing the strategic relationship with Russia. Okay, let's get into the second part. Why have most Latin American countries criticized Russia? And here, I'm also plugging another article in this special issue. It's an article by Tom Long and Carsten Andreas Schulz. And they argue that in the region, there is not only the pluralist tradition that Juan Pablo Scarfi pays attention to, there is also a Republican tradition of engaging the international order. And here by Republican, I mean Republican international thinking, not Republican as in the political party in the US. So bear with me. So they argue that Latin American countries have traditionally defended legal principles such as non-intervention and self-determination, and these countries have also promoted collective responses to security crisis. So in this way, Latin American countries have opposed unilateral approaches to solving controversies. Tom Long and Carson Andreas Schulz, they pay attention to the 19th century, especially to the US trying to solve different economic and financial crises in the region unilaterally, and then Latin America reacting as a group by saying, well, we don't want the US unilaterally intervening. We need to have international organizations, regional international organizations, and collective responses to this. So they pay attention to how this is Republican in the sense of a balance of power and everyone should have an equal vote, and trying to avoid the domination of great powers in this case against minor powers. And here, Latin American representatives have cited this tradition during their participation in the UN debates when they justify their votings. They have said that they want strong multilateral organizations. They have said that this is a violation of the principle of self-determination, that this is basically a crime because it's using military force to try to solve a security crisis, especially a non-provoked security crisis, according to these countries. These countries argue that the effects of also economic sanctions, if Latin America imposes them, would be minimal. So even when they criticize Russian actions as an aggression, an unprovoked aggression, and something that is illegal, they also don't want to engage in imposing economic sanctions. They say, following that Republican tradition, that economic sanctions are unilateral. They are not a collective response. They are not multilaterally coordinated. It's just certain states putting up the sanctions, or maybe states coordinating among themselves, but not going through multilateral collective organizations to try to impose them in a coordinated way. So in that way, it would be anti-Republican potentially, because it's not following those collective mechanisms to implement a strategy or an action. And also, there's different Latin American countries point out that it's not like if they put economic sanctions, that would hurt Russia too much. For example, as of 2020, Latin America's share in Russia's trade was 2.1%, while Russia's share in Latin American trade was only 0.64%. Mexico and Brazil are Russia's main economic partners in the region, but even there, the share of the trade is not that big. So what Latin American countries say is that this is a unilateral action and that it wouldn't hurt Russia that much. And also we have to remember that the Republican tradition in Latin America also came up as a response to the US trying to impose financial sanctions and resolve financial controversies. So there is a little bit also of reticence to go back to that specific thing that they were fighting against in the 19th century, potentially. Whatever. Diplomatic elites have also used multilateralism and international law as tools to seek pacific solutions to controversies and limits on the use of force. And this is well in accordance with Tom Long and Carson's concept of Republican internationalism or Republican traditions, because these countries will not also send military aid, because they say that this is not going through the multilateral mechanisms to send help, and that sending military aid would only escalate the conflict even more. So now I think, though, that a test of these positions will be if there is a collective coordination of economic sanctions or a collective coordination of sending military aid to Ukraine. If that happened, I wonder if Latin American countries would participate or not. If the whole point of this idea of a Republican tradition is that it needs to be collectively coordinated, what would happen if that actually happens? If there is a collective coordination of economic sanctions and a collective coordination of security aid. I'm not sure if Latin American countries would participate, but that would be the test for this justification for why they don't want to impose economic sanctions and send military aid. Now let's go into the question of what is going on with Mexico and Brazil. Mexico and Brazil are the two Latin American non-permanent members in the UN Security Council during this period. And they stand out among Latin American countries because their career diplomats have criticized Russia, while their presidents are a little bit more reticent to do so. And we have Bolsonaro actually turning a blind eye on what is happening. For me, these two countries exemplify the tension that can emerge between the pluralist tradition and the republican tradition of engaging the international order in Latin America. On the one hand, Brazilian and Mexican representatives have described Russian actions in Ukraine as an illegal use of force and a crime of aggression. They have voted in favor of different UN resolutions at the Security Council and the General Assembly against the Russian invasion, and they justified the reluctance to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council, arguing that they want an inclusive multilateral system, and that kicking out a country from the system would be discriminatory and not inclusive. So even when these different actions seem contradictory, they're actually consistent with the Republican tradition of using a collective system, trying to be inclusive, trying to have some equality among different states. On the other hand, though, Brazil has criticized Western sanctions as indiscriminate and not conducted to a peaceful solution of the conflict. The Mexican president, for instance, has also stated that he will not approve economic sanctions because he wants, quote, to have good relations with all governments, end quote, and not only with Western nations. And these different actions have sparked criticisms, both domestically in these countries, but also from abroad. Even if those positions could be criticized, I think that they are consistent with the pluralist tradition. Because remember that the pluralist tradition is trying to use international organizations and international law to criticize Western imperialism. So they are using this to say that NATO is expanding, and because of that, Russia was reacting, and thus this is a legitimate reaction from Russia. Let's have a second Q&A, a quickly second Q&A, and then we will end up with a final conclusion. Questions?
I think my question then to what I know more Brazil's position is what about the war crimes that are being committed? For example, yesterday the bombing of those how's it called civilian corridors for like fleeing Ukraine.
Yeah, especially the bombing of the train station.
Yeah. So like 100 of people were injured, 50 people died at least. And so in this case, it is different from taking a stand towards Russia's reaction towards NATO's expansion, but it's committing war crimes.
Yeah. The issue in international law, though, is that I think that the case for this being a crime of aggression, the Russian invasion of Ukraine being a crime of aggression, is going to be an easy case to bring to different international courts. It's more difficult to prove that there is a crime against humanity. I think that the evidence is there. Especially, I think that Ukrainians have been very savvy at using technology to create an archive of what Russia is doing to then actually try to bring this to different courts and try to keep Russia accountable for this. But it's difficult. And Brazil has a long tradition, even with Lula, of being skeptical of humanitarian crime law, thinking that this could also be a justification that Western powers could then use to intervene in countries, claiming that there is a humanitarian crisis to just cover up different interests. Celso Amorim, for example, the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs during Lula, before the coalition of the willing, he was a little bit skeptical of the responsibility to protect proposal by basically saying that this could be a Trojan horse that then Western countries could use. Brazil ended up supporting R2P, but they also wanted to have like some limits of how R2P could be implemented. But there is this tradition of being skeptical of when someone says this is a crime against humanity, we should do something. So even when I personally think that this is a humanitarian crime, and I personally think that it could be a case that could be brought upon with a lot of evidence, I think that the Brazilian skepticism is consistent. It's not only something that Bolsonaro is doing. We could engage in a counterfactual exercise by thinking, by trying to think what Lula would have done if he would have been the president in this moment. And I don't know. There are a lot of people in the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Itamaraty, that could potentially be also skeptical. Because there is this reticence. Okay.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
So there's a different counterfactual, which is, had the Russian intervention be a swift and quick victory, we wouldn't be talking about crimes against humanity at all.
Yep.
And isn't also the burden of proof for crimes against humanity that they have to show these were policies?
Yep.
That the Russian government actually
there's an intention.
has an intention
Yep.
to it's not collateral damage and things
Yep.
like that. They're trying to kill the civilians.
Yep.
No?
Different way of framing that counterfactual, which is a little bit more pessimistic, is what would have happened if the Russians would have been more effective at covering this up.
Of course. Yeah.
A lot of, mind you, a lot of Western analysts have saying that what is happening in Bucha is just an example of Russia not being careful enough, and that this might be happening in other parts of invaded Ukraine. It's just that the Russians have been very good at covering that up. I think it's something that we need more evidence, and that is also what the Brazilian and the Mexican diplomats in the UN are saying. We need to do more investigations. We need more evidence of this, just to have the actual empirical evidence to say, like, yeah, these are crimes against humanity because they pass the threshold of how many people are dying, which sounds terrible to say, but there is a threshold in order to bring a case upon, and in order to also prove that this is a policy that the Russian military is using. But yeah. Okay. Let me finish with, in case that this wasn't scary enough, with the potential risks that the Russian invasion of Ukraine could have against the UN as a system and to the global nuclear order. On April 5th, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, addressed the UN Security Council a day after visiting the Kyiv suburb of Bucha. He claimed that Russia was committing a crime of aggression by invading Ukraine, but also he made the case that Russia was committing a war crime by killing civilians. He reminded delegates that the main purpose of the UN, especially the UN Security Council, was to maintain and make sure that peace is adhered to. He warned delegates that, quote, if this situation continues, the states will be accustomed only to the strength of weapons to ensure their security. The UN could simply end, end quote. And this warning might resonate in Latin America, regardless of which tradition you are using. Countries in the region, the pluralist tradition and the Republican tradition, both traditions, have promoted a robust multilateral architecture to respond to crisis and prevent abuses by great powers. Latin American diplomatic elites, the Brazilians especially, have argued that weakening this structure would represent the single greatest security threat to international peace. However, Latin American governments have followed different paths to strengthen this multilateral architecture in response to the Russian invasion. Most countries have voted in favor of suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council, of criticizing what Russia is doing, using multilateralism and international law. And what they are saying is that we need to keep countries accountable when they break the law. And if you don't keep them accountable, this will create a crisis of multilateralism. Brazil and Mexico have abstained, for example, from this resolution that wanted to kick out Russia from the Human Rights Council, calling for a thorough investigation of the events in Bucha and claiming that excluding members from certain organizations would weaken the organization. So the whole point is that there are certain thresholds for these crimes, and the multilateral system should include members and not exclude them. So they say that if you blindly criticize a country, or if you blindly try to use the law without actually having a fair trial and the rule of law, that would weaken the multilateral system. So as you can see, there are different ways in which these countries are using these diplomatic traditions to try to strengthen the multilateral system. A group wants to do it by enforcing the rules and keeping violators accountable, and the other group wants to enforce it by being inclusive and by guaranteeing that there is actually a violation before triggering the different actions. Also, Latin American representatives have echoed an argument that the deputy Russian ambassador made before the vote in the General Assembly by basically claiming that excluding a member from any organization would weaken existing human rights architectures, in the specific case of the Human Rights Council. So even there is this fear that, well, the multilateral system should be inclusive, every member should be equal, so if we kick one out, maybe that would also weaken the structure. Now, Latin American representatives have introduced proposals attempting to address Zelensky's warning. For instance, Mexico, in the Security Council, worked with France and introduced a draft resolution demanding civilian protections in Ukraine and calling for unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. Russia vetoed the draft, and then Russia tried to also use a humanitarian resolution, and then Mexico and France said that wasn't enough. And then Mexico and France took their draft resolution to the General Assembly, and they actually adopted it on March 24th. Now, Mexico and France have worked together in the past in the Security Council to limit veto powers in the UN. What they have said is that it is necessary to reform the UN, especially the Security Council, to democratize it, and that the veto powers are actually producing inequalities in this system, and that this they were saying this in 2015 with a little bit of prescience, but they said that whenever there would be a conflict involving one of the veto powers would be able to veto any kind of resolution trying to prevent that conflict. And here we are, with Russia vetoing different resolutions that have been put forward trying to solve the crisis. So I wonder if this crisis would make Mexico and France try to reform the Security Council yet again by putting certain limits on how the veto right can be used. Now, if this situation isn't scary enough already, the Russian invasion also threatens the multilateral architecture upholding nuclear non-proliferation and arms control mechanisms. Ukraine became an independent country and a nuclear power when the Soviet Union collapsed. And then Ukraine also became, as I said, a nuclear power by accident. They ended up with a lot of the Soviet nuclear weapons in their territory. Western countries, especially the US, pressure Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal. And even then, some observers, like Mearsheimer, argued that Ukraine should keep its arsenal to deter future Russian aggression. And the current crisis has made some countries consider proliferation as a strategy to prevent future conflict. Ukrainians themselves are thinking whether it was actually a good decision to give up these weapons or not. But you also have a clear example of countries rethinking their strategies in South Korea, where there is a consistent high public support for proliferation to deter a North Korean attack. And there is a fellow at CSAC, Lawrence Suke, who also argues that South Korea is afraid of the US being too adamant to defend them. So they think that if you rely a lot on a country like the US that could escalate a conflict, that might not be in your best interest. So maybe the best strategy is to have your own nuclear weapon so that you can engage with North Korea instead of relying on the US. Especially because the US could try to prove that they are committed to your security way too much and escalate a conflict, dragging South Korea into this conflict. Latin American countries, until now, have reacted in the opposite direction. They see the Ukrainian crisis as an example of the escalation dangers of a conflict involving one or more nuclear powers. And they have asked for complete disarmament. The review conference of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been delayed forever because of the different COVID waves might happen if nothing happens in August. And Latin American delegations have said that they are going to ask for stricter disarmament measures to actually keep nuclear powers accountable to a commitment that they made in 1968 to actually have strong, robust disarmament measures. So we'll see what happens in August during the REDCON. So let me conclude with three main takeaways. The first one is that there is a tension between two diplomatic traditions informing the Latin American reactions, a pluralist and a Republican tradition. And I think that US foreign policy makers could pay attention to the Republican tradition to try to gain support from Latin America for the different actions, instead of just seeing this as, well, authoritarian countries will support an authoritarian country. If they pay attention to these traditions, they might actually find a way of convincing Latin American countries to be an ally in the different actions that they want to implement. Second takeaway, Latin American governments will not support unilateral actions, including sanctions, over collective responses. This is in line with the Republican tradition of using multilateral organizations, promoting coordinated solutions, and promoting collective solutions. The test, then again, will be if the UN actually collectively decides to implement economic sanctions and send military aid. And we will see what Latin Americans do in that case. Third and final takeaway. The Latin American reluctance to criticize Russia, in my opinion, and this is only a hypothesis, is more an anti-Western reaction than a pro-Russian stance. We will see what happens with this hypothesis as the conflict evolves. And we will see also how Latin Americans adapt the positions and their reactions to this conflict. So, just to conclude, I did not have time to get into this debate, but we can engage in a conversation about this. But this conflict also forces Latin Americans, especially the left. For now, I've been talking about the states and what governments are doing, but if we pay attention to populations and Latin Americans, the conflict might force the left in Latin America to rethink their positions on great powers interventions. And maybe we will see a left response criticizing interventions by great powers and not only US interventions when they happen. But then again, we will see how the conflict evolves, we will see how Latin Americans' positions evolve, and we will see how Latin Americans, as people, also react to this crisis. Thanks again for having me. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Questions? There is one in the chat that I can convey to you, which is about Bucha. And the question is the suspicions that came about sort of possibilities of misinformation on the Ukrainian side as well.
Yeah.
And I guess the way I would frame that as well is just if you these investigations that Brazil or Mexico is calling upon, who would do them? I mean, how would that kind of investigation work, and how does the international regime deals with those kinds of things?
So there are different ways of doing this. The UN Security Council could ask for a resolution and then partner with different regional organizations, but that the UN Security Council is asking for to send different investigators. But it's not like the IAEA for nuclear weapons, for example, where there are inspectors trained to go into a country and see what is the nuclear program or the nuclear enterprise to actually see if that country is attempting to proliferate or not. There is not a group of humanitarian crime investigators to go and see what is happening. The UN could call for a tribunal and actually have some inspectors go and gather the different facts to try to see what is happening. But this wouldn't be a short process, which is the main criticism against the Mexican and the Brazilian position. Yeah, we need more information. And it would be great to have a commission actually going into Bucha, going into all of these different regions and seeing what is happening. Exactly to avoid all the suspicion that this might either be Ukrainian misinformation. It will take a long time though. And if this is a time-sensitive situation where you need a response, maybe an investigation in terms of time sensitivity is not the best option.
So in terms of multilateral institutions and I think the Republican way of thinking that you were talking about, I have a question, and I have to preface it by saying that I know this is a fantasy beyond a fantasy, but if the United States were to bind itself to organizations like the ICC by signing the Rome Treaty, could that be persuasive to different Latin American leaders?
Great question, especially because, I mean, the US was one of those countries that was leading the creation of the ICC, and then it wasn't ratified. And now the Biden administration is criticizing Russia by basically saying that they could be brought up to the ICC, when Russia is actually not a member of the ICC either, is also questioning the US commitment to this regime. I don't think the US would enter the ICC. It would trigger a lot of different backlash domestically and a lot of different processes internationally that I don't think the US wants to get into. If the counterfactual is, if the US gets into the ICC, would that bring Russia closer to accountability? I don't know that either. Because then again, Russia is not part of the ICC. So the fact that the US binds itself doesn't mean that Russia, in reaction, would bind itself too. So I don't know.
So then, by your argument, because Ukraine in 2012 did submit the action in the eastern part to the ICC, and so there is the international legal argument that it is under. So do you think that's just too much of a thin legal argument for it to be plausible?
Can you reframe the question? So is the argument that...
So after the initial Russian invasion in Crimea, Ukraine went to the ICC and submitted jurisdiction from that point on in that conflict to the ICC, so the legal argument could be made. What I'm asking you more about is the political support from Latin American countries. So apart from the rules that need to be followed, if the United States was itself submitting more to the international legal system, could politically that make it more plausible?
Yeah. If the counterfactual is, Ukraine is putting or letting the ICC inspectors come in, check what is happening, gather evidence, and at the same time the US gets into the ICC, would the pluralist tradition stop working? Or would people using pluralist arguments suddenly have no ground to say that this is just a US attempt to, I don't know, threaten security in Russia? Yeah. But those two ifs are so difficult to happen. Or time sensitive. Like Ukraine might actually let different inspectors come in and gather evidence. That will take a long time.
Well, your last question, brief.
Okay, yeah. So from what I've heard from other professors here at Stanford as well, like FSI and also SciSec, most of them agree with the view that like Putin really believes in this sort of like idea that the Western is trying to attack Russia, and that he's really into this argument that we might think that is a complete fantasy and that is crazy. Do you think that if Latin America would have a stronger position against Russia, that this argument that Putin is presented would disappear? Because
I don't think so. Because what the crisis is also representing is that the concept of the global south as just one actor is not true. Latin America is not the only region that has been divided in how they are reacting to Russia. The whole global south is divided in how to react to the Russian actions. So even if you take away the Latin American allies, you would have other countries saying that this is just a natural reaction from Russia to NATO's expansion. And also, if there is no country supporting Putin, I don't think that he would change his mind. Or I don't think he would change his assessment or the justifications he's using. So the isolation of Russia, I don't think would change the course what is happening on its own.
And what about the support of the Russian population itself? Because then that could possibly change.
Yeah, but that assumes that the Russian population would have access to the knowledge that there are countries that are not supporting Russia anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Well, we need to learn more, but I have to stop our formal broadcast of the talk right now. So we've listened to Latin American reactions to the Ukrainian crisis with the Stanton Fellow Luis Rodriguez, and please join us next Friday here in class. We will be talking about electrifying Mexico, technology and transformation of a modern city with Professor Diana Montaño. So thank you so much, Luis, for this.
Thank you for having me.
So what we do now